Okay, so Christians from all walks of life, all centuries, who did things that made a massive difference in the world around them. Some of them are full-scale world changers. Some of them are people where it was much, much more local, their impact, but they had a significant impact. And they weren't clergy. Well, some of them were, but not many. They were just people from daily walks of life who, by living out their faith consistently and faithfully, by understanding that when Jesus says he's Lord of all, it means all. It means everything. And so as Christians, it's our job to bring the lordship of Christ to bear in every area of life. And so the stories were designed to illustrate that. Now, I had someone yesterday ask me about Christian-Muslim relations. So, well, what I was asked to do today is tell some stories. Okay. All right, so I'm going to be telling stories. But someone asked me about Christian-Muslim relations. And so the first person I want to tell you about is a guy by the name of Hunayn ibn Ishaq. Yeah, right. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, it was a Syrian Christian, Church of the East, for those of you who've been hearing me talk about this, so an historian. But he was living under the Caliphate. The Muslim conquests of the Middle East and North Africa had occurred. It's the 9th century. The Muslims are actually in Spain as well. And he's living in Syria. And the thing about Islam, or the early Caliphate, is that the leaders were typically illiterate. And further, they knew that even those who could read, they didn't have the intellectual firepower that you could get in the Greek world, over in the Eastern Empire, Byzantium. They were well aware of this. And in fact, they frequently would hire Christians or Jews, because they were literate, to be administrators, to do all kinds of things within the empire, the Caliphate, the empire, even to the point of some of them rising to the position of vizier, essentially prime minister, as a Christian or as a Jew in the Muslim world, because they knew they needed literate, educated people to handle these kinds of things, given the size and expanse of the Caliphate. So Hunayn ibn Ishaq was living around Baghdad. He started being trained as a physician. He asked too many questions. And as a result, the head of the hospital basically told him, kicked him out. And so instead of getting his training there, he went across to the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, where he studied, he'd mastered Greek. He studied all of, Galen and all of the other Greek medical writings and things like that. He learned philosophy, all of these kinds of things. And then he came back and began working initially in the hospital. But the Caliph heard about this guy. And so he asked him to come and be his personal physician. So he was working as the personal physician of the Caliph. Then the Caliph asked him to start translating Greek medical texts into Arabic. And so he began doing this. And the payment for this was he would pay Hunayn the weight of the treatise in gold. That's how valuable these things were. So he begins translating these treatises. His son joins him. They start translating Aristotle, all of these kinds of things into Arabic, sometimes from Greek to Syriac to Arabic, but they end up getting them into Arabic. And so he is making a very good living doing this, as well as acting as the private physician to the Caliph. Now, here's the problem, though. In the Caliphate, Christians and Jews were, frankly, second-class citizens. They had a status called dhimmi, which I'm not going to bother translating it. It gets complicated here. But what it means is they had a second-class status. They were allowed to continue as Christians or Jews with all kinds of restrictions on them. And basically, if the caliph decided he didn't like them, or even a Muslim neighbor decided they didn't like them, they could be in real trouble very quickly. So he's in a very precarious position. He's got to stay, if he wants to stay alive, frankly, he needs to stay in the caliph's good graces. Well, at one point, the caliph came to him and said, you're a physician, you know medicines, you know herb, you know all of these herbs, you know all of these kinds of things. I need you to concoct a poison for some of my enemies. And he flatly refused. He said, as a physician, I am sworn to heal people, not hurt them. I will not do that. The caliph threw him in prison, kept him in prison for a year. And after the year, he took him out and said, look, you're either going to make the poison or I'm going to behead you. And he said, I can't do it. And the caliph at that point says, this guy's valuable. Okay, this was just a test. I just wanted to. So he actually spares his life. But when he was asked afterwards why he didn't do it on threat of death, he said, well, first of all, I'm a physician and I'm sworn to heal, not to harm. But secondly, I'm a Christian. And Jesus tells us we are to love our enemies, how much more our friends. So I can't do this. He was willing to risk his life for being a proper physician, but also for the sake of obeying Christ. Now, Ibn Ishaq is also going to, he'll do ophthalmological treatises. He does a lot of really interesting work on the eye. He actually developed methods of treating cataracts, all kinds of things. I mean, so he's not just a translator. He's actually a researcher, an active physician, all of these kinds of things. Now, here's the punchline of this. One of the stereotypes that we get of the Muslim world versus the medieval Europeans is the Muslims were far more advanced. It was a more sophisticated civilization. They had much better medicine, all of these kinds of things. They were into philosophy way before the Europeans were and all that. It's almost like the Europeans were still banging the rocks together when they've got this elite civilization. It's not true on a lot of levels. But the important thing you need to note is that the reason why Islamic civilization was ahead of Western Europe is because they had access to Greek learning, which continued in Constantinople in the Eastern Roman Empire. They had access to Greek learning, but that Greek learning came to them through Christian translators. It was Christians who translated the works that created the golden age of Islam, that created the context of Muslim medicine, which for a while was frankly pretty advanced over Europe, although over time that changes as well. Just a quick story on that. One of my subspecialties is the Black Death. I am really good at plague. Tempting as it is to go into this more, I just want to note one point. When plague hit, the Europeans, the Europeans, everybody, it's a pandemic. It's across Asia, it's across North Africa, the Middle East, Europe, everywhere. It's not just the Europeans that get it. But they naturally want to know what's going on. So they asked the theology faculty at the University of Paris, what is this? What's happening? Why the theology faculty? Well, in this period, what we call science was actually considered a branch of theology. They called it natural theology. So they would be the people tasked. They're the people who are educated in science. And the answer they came up with, for us, seems rather fanciful. They said, well, is God responsible? Well, yes, because God is kind of responsible for everything. But this isn't a direct divine action or a direct judgment or anything of the sort. Instead, what's happening is there's a conjunction of planets, which is astrology, which is, it's unhealthy. And what it's doing is it's causing a poisonous vapor to rise up from the earth. And it's that corrupted air that's what's causing the plague. Now, that, by the way, leads to some really interesting things. One of them is a massive improvement in public sanitation to try to get rid of bad smells and things like that, because they thought it would fix the problem. Ultimately, it leads to things like plague doctor masks and all that. But now, that's a really fanciful explanation. We look at this and say, well, this is just superstitious nonsense. What it is state-of-the-art medicine. That was Greek medicine. They were going back to Galen and all these other guys because they finally got those texts in there. Now, like I said, we think of this as superstitious, but what's interesting is they're looking for a natural explanation for it, recognizing, yeah, God's behind it because God created the universe and everything moves according to his design. But there's a natural explanation, and since there's a natural explanation, it can be treated. Contrast the Islamic world. By this point, there's a resurgence of what we could call perhaps Islamic fundamentalism. Anything that doesn't line up with the Quran needs to be thrown out. And so what you find in the Quran is that whenever an epidemic disease breaks out, Allah sends it. Allah determines who gets ill and who doesn't, and who dies and who doesn't. It's all the direct action of Allah. There was a physician in Spain who wrote a treatise trying to talk about how to prevent and treat plague. He was arrested for apostasy because he was trying to thwart the will of Allah. A mob broke into the prison and lynched him. There were other physicians, much smarter ones, other physicians, Muslim physicians, who would say, well, before we got the glorious Quran, Arabs believed that disease was contagious, that it could pass from person to person, not with Allah's involvement. And so what they would do when a disease broke out and they would lay out a program for dealing with plague, and then they would add, but we, of course, since we've gotten the glorious Quran, know that this isn't really the way it works. So they sort of snuck it in the back door. But they had to do that because otherwise they could have been lynched too. So this myth that Muslim medicine was so advanced and the Muslims were so open-minded and things like that, frankly, doesn't really line up. Early centuries, yeah, because they didn't have this resurgent Islamism, let's call it. But later, the Europeans actually catch up and pass them right during the middle of the Middle Ages. Okay, so that's one story. Let me give you another one. We were talking last night about Vikings. So let me give you another story dealing with Christian Vikings. And yes, there is such a thing. But I'm going to start with some non-Christian ones. There was a man in Norway who, he got involved in a conflict with his neighbor, and he began what amounts to being a tradition in the family for dealing with conflict resolution. He murdered the guy. So the net result is he was exiled from Norway and went to Iceland. There he had a son by the name of Eric, known as Eric the Red. Eric the Red, some of his slaves caused an avalanche accidentally, which killed a guy's sheep. So he went out and killed the guy's slaves. So Eric the Red, we've got a conflict resolution situation. He killed the guy. So Eric got exiled from Iceland. He went to a nearby island. And on this nearby island, one of his neighbors had it's kind of hard to explain. It's a house beam, but it was carved in certain ways, so it was considered sacred, magical, and all of that. And Eric had left it with him for safekeeping. Oh, by the way, the first guy that Eric killed, his name was Eyjolf the Foul. You gotta love these Viking names. But in any event, the other guy had this beam. Eric moved in. He asked him to return it. He wouldn't do it. And so we've got another system of conflict resolution, and a couple of his guys end up dead. At that point, they exile Eric out from Icelandic lands altogether, so he goes and starts the first Viking colony in Greenland. Okay. All right, so that's Eric. He had a son named Leif Erikson. Now, let's pause on Leif for a moment and go back to Norway. The king of Norway at this time was a man named Olaf I. And Olaf had converted to Christianity. He was not the first Viking king to convert to Christianity. That was a guy who was known as Håkon the Good. Håkon, unfortunately, was murdered by the children of Eric Bloodaxe. You gotta love these names. But Olaf then is the first king of Norway that is really trying to make Christianity stick. And he is doing this as only a Viking would. When Iceland refused to allow Christian churches on the island, he blockaded it and told them that nobody was going in or out until they opened the churches. Okay. He was known to threaten people and actually carry out threats of torture and death to people who refused to convert. I don't recommend this. This isn't a good approach to evangelism, but this was Olaf. Leif comes to his court. He's not exiled. His father is exiled. He can go back to Norway. He can go to Iceland, wherever. He goes to Norway. He goes to Olaf's court and voluntarily becomes a Christian. It's one of the things they don't tell you in your school books, that Leif Erikson was a Christian. He voluntarily becomes a Christian, and Olaf tells him, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go back to Greenland, to your father's colony, and start a Christian church there. And he sent a priest or two with him to help with this. And so Leif sets off to go to Greenland on a missionary journey. Now, a little bit about sailing technology. Viking ships, had all the oars and things like that. You've seen them, but they also had a mast with a square sail. If you have a square sail, you only sail effectively when the wind is behind you. You don't have a lot of ability to tack. If you've got triangular sails, you can actually tack back and forth to go forward into a wind. But with a square sail, you've got very, very limited ability to do that. So you need a wind behind you to go across the North Atlantic. But the problem is the prevailing winds go from west to east. So how, as a Viking trying to go from Norway to Iceland or to Greenland, how do you manage to do this? The wind isn't going to be behind you. And just believe me, you don't want to row it. Okay, so how do you do this? Well, it turns out that there are times when winds blow from east to west in the Atlantic. Even though the prevailing winds tend to be from the west, there are times when they go the other direction. And specifically, this happens when you have big storms, cyclones, hurricanes, things like that. At that point, the wind goes cyclonic, and at least around the north end, the wind is blowing to the east. From east to west. What this means is that the way the Vikings sailed across the North Atlantic was riding the edge of hurricanes. These guys are absolutely nuts, okay? But okay, so not surprisingly, when Leif is heading toward Greenland, riding the edge of the storms, he missed it. And, well, he rescued a few people that had shipwrecked that told him that there was land further west. And so he lands there, and we know he landed in the area of Newfoundland. We've found Viking remains there that conclusively demonstrate that he was in that area. Maybe moving as far south as New York. They called the area Vinland, which means wine land, because they had lots and lots of grapes there, and they started a colony there. There was a woman, by the way, with him named Gudrid, known as Gudrid the Far Traveler, who had the first European born in the New World. Her son was the first European born in the New World. She's got a great story, too. But ultimately, Leif decided he needed to leave the New World, abandon the New World colony, because of, the Native Americans didn't get along with them very well. And so they were actually driven out. The Vikings referred to the Native Americans as skrælings, which is a word that translates roughly to barbarians. You got to wonder what makes a Viking call somebody a barbarian. Okay, but anyway, he then left Vinland and went to Greenland to complete his mission. And he began working to evangelize the Greenland colony. His mother became a Christian almost immediately. His father really was committed to the old gods, to Thor, Odin, all those guys. It's not clear in the records. The stories we have vary on this. Some of them say Eric never converted. Others say in the end he did because of pressure from his wife. The story goes that she refused to sleep with him unless he became a Christian, and ultimately he did. So this begins, his wife actually builds the first church in Greenland. And this begins a period in which the Greenland colony, the Viking colony in Greenland, remains firmly Christian. The last record we have of the Viking colony in Greenland from 1300s was a record of a wedding held at a Christian church there. So Leif's voyage, which we always think of in connection with the New World, the real point of that voyage was the conversion of that colony, and in fact, he succeeded in doing that. So that's the second story for you. I want to jump to the modern period. In a CREC church, this one seems particularly appropriate to me. It involves a man by the name of Arthur Guinness. Arthur Guinness, his father was a brewer. Arthur grew up apprenticing to his father, learned brewing. There was a bishop in Ireland by the name of Price, possibly actually a relation to Tom Price, the guy you do the podcast with. And Arthur's dad was his brewer. When Bishop Price passed away, he left a bequest to Arthur. Evidently, he liked Arthur, to give him the investment he needed to start his own brewery. So he opened one, and then, in mark of someone who is, I think, an amazingly effective negotiator, he found a piece of land in Dublin at St. James Gate and negotiated a lease on that land. It was for £100 down and something like £46 a year, renewable for 9,000 years. This is prime territory in the middle of Dublin, and they have to pay £46 a year on it. It's wonderful. And actually, if you go to the Guinness Brewery there, the lease is in the floor with a glass thing over it. You can go see the lease. Ask me how I know that. So he begins the brewery there. Now, he develops Guinness Stout, which rapidly becomes the most popular beer in Ireland and actually passes over to England as well. And Arthur becomes a very, very wealthy man. Now, what most people don't know about Arthur is that he was an evangelical Christian. He attended churches where John Wesley preached regularly, and he was very much impressed with Wesley's teaching about the good that wealth can do. And so he dedicated himself not just to his brewing business, but to philanthropy, for doing good things for the community. He's on the board of directors at Meath Hospital. And Meath is the county that Dublin is in. He's on the board of directors there, and he sees to it that the hospital takes care of the poor and the indigent. He joins the St. Patrick's Society, which is an effort to ban dueling and to fight dueling in Ireland. He is involved in the Sunday school movement. Sunday school in this period isn't this kind of thing. Kids worked. And they didn't have the opportunity to go to school. They would work in the fields or in the factories that are emerging in the Industrial Revolution, and they never had an opportunity to get an education. Sunday schools were founded because Sunday was the one day the kids had off. Sunday schools were founded to give kids basic education so that they would not be trapped in factory work, so that they would learn things so that they could improve themselves and improve where they are. Sunday school was developed initially for that reason, so he's involved in that. He actually treats both Catholic and Protestant workers in his business equally, which was unprecedented in Ireland in this time. So Arthur has this strong philanthropic element to what he's doing. And according to some sources, one of the reasons why he was really interested in promoting beer is the alternative for the lower classes was gin. and gin is a lot worse. Actually, if you look at the numbers, Guinness Stout is it's got more calcium than milk, more vitamin C than orange juice. I mean, it's really pretty incredible stuff. Yeah. You know, I actually gave this talk once for the Colson Fellows Group. It's a training thing that the Colson Center does. And the Colson Center's headquarters is focused on the family. And so I was asked to do a series of Christians who changed their world, and I picked Arthur Guinness because I wanted to put the Guinness logo up on the wall at Focus. But at any rate, he passes down this philanthropic idea is passed into the DNA of the Guinness Corporation. And the effect of this is, well, you know, as you're moving into the 19th century, Dublin is the most unhealthy city in Europe. Lifespans are short. Their epidemic diseases go through it regularly. It's filthy. There's virtually no sanitation, nothing like that. And this was the era in which public health was emerging as a subfield of medicine. And the Guinness Board of Directors, this is a generation or two after Arthur, the Guinness Board of Directors, it's still owned by the family, by the way, at that point. It's since been sold. But at that point, it was still owned by the family. And the Board of Directors contacts a guy named John Lumsden. He's later knighted and becomes Sir John Lumsden. He's one of the first physicians that is really interested in public health. They hire him to do a survey of what's the situation among our workers and in Dublin general. What can you tell us, and what kind of recommendations can you give to help improve this? And he went through the slums and the tenements, the filth and everything else. He documents all of it, and he gave them an extensive series of recommendations of what to do. You know, educating people, cleaning these things up, helping wives understand how to run a healthy household, how to maintain, you know, proper sanitation, cleanliness, and all this. You know, on and on and on. Massive list of things. In some cases, if I remember right, literally tearing down buildings and putting up new ones because they were essentially impossible. The Guinness board accepted every one of them. And they transformed Dublin from an absolute pit of a city into a clean, modern, healthy city that we have today. Guinness is responsible for that, the Guinness Corporation. The family didn't all stay in brewing. Some of them went into finance. Some of them went into theology. Henry Grattan Guinness, the grandson of Arthur Guinness, was actually sort of the D.L. Moody of England. He established a school to help train people for the China Inland Mission. He wanted to go himself, but Hudson Taylor said, no, you've got jobs here to do. Set up the school. And that line, so you got the finance Guinnesses who are known as the Guinnesses for gold. The theology Guinnesses are the Guinnesses for God. And that line continues most recently with a gentleman by the name of Os Guinness. He is a straight descendant, if you know Oz, he's a straight descendant from Arthur through the Henry Guinness side of the family. Oz at one point commented to me that the Guinness Corporation has done more good than any other corporation in history. And as I look at it, I think he's right. So what do we have here? We have a scholar physician, Hunayn ibn Ishaq. We've got a Viking. We've got a brewer. Let's go to someone, let's go to a pastor. We're going to move up to the 1939, 1940, right in that era, in a little village in France called Le Chambon-sur-Lignon. The pastor there of the Reformed Church is a man by the name of André Trocmé. And he and his wife Magda, this is a region that was historically a Huguenot region. It's a region that was historically Protestant. Even in the era in which Protestantism was illegal in France, from 1685 until after the French Revolution, this area stayed Protestant. And they managed to keep a lot of things underground and things like that. But these are Protestants whose families have been Protestant since the 16th century. Okay. Germany invades France. They take over France, they seize certain sections of it and make it part of Germany, and they install a puppet government, the Vichy government, in France. And they're begin the process of persecuting the Jews. One day, a Jewish woman showed up at Andre and Magda's house and asked for help. And Magda was caught flat-footed. She didn't know what to do. She sort of directed them somewhere else to somebody else who might be able to help them. But this really bothered her, and she talked to her husband about it, and they agreed that they needed to do something about this. And so they, with their congregation, they began to systematically hide Jews who were coming to them for help and smuggle them off, actually, frequently into Switzerland. But they actually managed to hide them in the community. The Vichy government became aware of what was going on. And they didn't have hard proof, but they knew. And so they came to Andre and they said to him, look, you need to knock this off. When Jews show up, you need to turn them over to the authorities. And he said, I don't know what a Jew is. I only know what people are. These people are my flock. And as their shepherd, it's my duty to protect them. 1942, mass deportations start taking place of Jews going to the death camps. Actually, here's a hint for you. If you're ever in Paris, this is not going to show up in your guidebooks. If you go to Notre Dame Cathedral, okay, the main doors are on the west end. On the east end, you have the apse. Go to the east end, cross the street, there's a little park. And from that park, there are, on two sides, there's a set of stairs going down. Go down those stairs. It'll put you into a courtyard with a doorway going into the underground there. And when you go in there, it's the monument to the Jews deported during World War II. There are 500,000 lights, one for each person deported that went to the death camps and never returned. Until you see this, you can't really comprehend the number. I don't know why this doesn't show up in the guidebooks, except maybe that the French are embarrassed about it. But it's something that is worth doing if you are ever in Paris. The Jews that went to Le Chambon, 1942, they're trying to deport Jews. And Andre and his people are hiding them. Andre's brother has a school in a nearby town. They're hiding them there. The Nazis raid the school. Andre's brother is taken and sent to the death camp with all the Jews. He dies. Andre and Magda continue their work. And the Nazis would come in, the Vichy government would come in. Throughout this entire time, not a single person in the entire region said a word. And at the end of the war, they stopped. It was done. Andre continued to live. He died in the 1970s, 76, I think. Hundreds of people were saved because of this village. And the faithfulness of the people who would not a single one of them said a word when it could have meant real rewards, or not speaking could have resulted in them being sent to the death camps. Nobody spoke a word. Years later, a filmmaker who was one of the children who was rescued at Le Chambon went back to ask them why they did it. It's a film called Weapons of the Spirit, hard to find. And when you watch it, you can see, there are these people who've never been really on camera before, and they're kind of stiff and not feeling at all comfortable with the situation. And when he asked why they did it, their reaction was basically, I don't understand the question. Isn't it obvious? It was the right thing to do. They have no other explanation. It was simply the right thing to do. Now, the interesting thing about this whole situation is that if you read accounts of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, what they will tell you is they were hiding the Jews in the forest and things like that, and they had signals when it was safe to come out and all of that sort of thing. That is only partially true. The rest of the story goes back to the days between 1685 and the French Revolution, when the Huguenots were persecuted. And what they would do, now this is in the Massif Central, it's the central area of France, reasonably close to Switzerland. In this period, they developed secret routes that they could use to smuggle pastors and Bibles and things like that into and out of Switzerland. And they had, like the priest holes in England, they had secret rooms that they would hide pastors in case the Catholic authorities went looking for them. When Protestantism was legalized again, they kept the knowledge of all of these secret routes and secret rooms and things like that. They kept the knowledge of it, but never told anyone. And that's what they used, in part, to rescue the Jews and to smuggle them off into Switzerland. As a matter of fact, when a Jewish person would arrive to the congregation, André Trocmé would tell the congregation, "We've received an Old Testament. Does anyone need one?" That was the code. If you go to Le Chambon and ask them about those secret rooms and passageways, the passes, they'll tell you they don't exist. If the people in this region get to know you well and they trust you, they will say, well, yeah, they're there and we know where they are, but we never show them to outsiders because we never know when we'll need them again. So what you have there is a pastor and a congregation. I'm sorry I get choked up when I'm talking about the Holocaust. I have relatives that most likely died in it. Yes, Sunshine is a Jewish name, in case you didn't know that. What you see in André and his congregation is a congregation, first of all, incredible courage, incredible faithfulness, and an incredible sense of what the right thing to do is, and a willingness to do it at whatever cost, and an unwillingness to compromise no matter what benefit would come to them. And I would argue that villages like Le Chambon-sur-Lignon are altogether too rare. Churches like that, frankly, are altogether too rare. What we need more than anything else right now are congregations that have that kind of extravagant faithfulness. Congregations who have leaders who are unwilling to bend or compromise, who have compassion for those who are suffering and who are being unjustly persecuted. But it's not just the pastors, it's the people of Le Chambon that to me are the most remarkable part of this story. Because not a single one of them gave even a hint of, that we're hiding Jews, or that there are any of them in the area. That kind of courage in a community, that kind of, using an old word, virtue in a community, is so rare as to be almost a unicorn in our world today. And is the thing I would like to leave you with here today, that as we look at, I've got all kinds of heroes and stories of people in the past who have done amazing things and stuff like that, but I wanted to end with this one, because I think it's a challenge to all of us, to our leaders, but also to the members of our congregation, to live this kind of life of absolute, uncompromising faithfulness. Le Chambon saved 600 people. Drop in the bucket in the Holocaust. But for those 600 people, it made a massive difference. And this was a very small village too. So, so that's what I would call you to. That we need to live lives like that. In whatever walk of life we are, certainly we need to bring our faith into our jobs, into our communities, and all of that. But we need extravagant faithfulness, especially as our culture is becoming increasingly dark. So, any questions?
This village this village that kept things so well secret and under tight lip. How did the authorities catch wind of?
Well, they knew that there were Jews that were moving around in the area, and then they sort of disappeared. I assume that they're generally aware of what's going on, and they know that there are Jews that are heading here. So, what's happening to them?
Your example of Ishaq,
Ishaq, yeah. Hunayn ibn Ishaq.
Okay.
Ibn, son of. Hunayn, son of Isaac. Hunayn ibn Ishaq.
Okay. Is that an example of what we might see of like a modern day Daniel, someone who is a Christian serving in a pagan government,
Yeah.
but in a sense seeking the good of the place that he's currently in?
Yeah, he would be an example of a Daniel. I think that's the perfect biblical analogy. Anyone else? That's you, yeah. Oh, okay.
You didn't really address this in your talk today, but I've been curious. Could you talk a little bit about the development of worship music through Christianity, from the Psalms to chanting, stuff like that?
Okay. This is not really my area, but I can give you an overview. The early church sang psalms. This was standard. In fact, there's a certain amount of argument that can be made that when you look at what happened in the synagogues, there's no record of them singing psalms until after the Christians were doing it. We actually don't have a record of it. So it may be that we started that. But psalms were the primary vehicle of worship music, really all the way through the Middle Ages. You will add other canticles, as they're called, that are taken from Scripture. Those are also used. During the Middle Ages, you begin getting other kinds of songs being written for worship. So one of the most famous sets of medieval music is from Alfonso the Wise of Spain in the 1200s. It's the Cantiga de Santa Maria. It's a set of nearly 500 songs about the Virgin Mary. Okay, so yeah, we're getting Catholic here. There's also, interestingly enough, also from Spain, there's a book called the Livre Vermell, the Green Book, that is a collection of songs from the monastery of Montserrat. Montserrat was on the pilgrimage route, the main pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. That's the big pilgrimage site in Europe. And the monastery opened itself up as a hostel for people. So they would come in and sleep there. And at night, they would sing songs and dance and things like that in the church. But the problem is that the lyrics of the songs were inappropriate. They got kind of bawdy and things like that. And the monks were kind of upset by this. So they took all of these popular melodies and they rewrote words to them, so that they became sacred music, but with popular tunes. Some of these are really funny. There's one that's really kind of fun and upbeat, and it's all about dying. So you have that going on. There are other kinds of music that are increasingly being written, choral music, things like that, in Paris and elsewhere. But all of this, except like the songs coming out of the cantigas or the Livre Vermell, all of the worship music itself is always done by professional choirs. The people in the medieval church, the people did not sing. They listened. Worship was entirely a spectator sport in the Middle Ages. Then Luther comes along. And what Luther does is, I mentioned, I believe he translates the liturgy into German so everybody understands it. He starts writing his own reflections on Psalms, like Psalm 46 becomes a mighty fortress is our God. He starts writing his own hymns and so on. And the German Reformation becomes a singing Reformation. Okay. The Catholics eventually pick up on this and start trying to introduce singing into Catholic churches, but to this day, I got to tell you, Catholic worship music is terrible. It's just, yeah. It's actually, yeah, well, I'm not going to go any further with that. But then you get to the Swiss Reformation, and you have Zwingli coming along, and Zwingli, again, wants to have this pared down, very simplistic, simplified, let's not call it simplistic, simplified, word-centered version of worship. He decides that the only thing that should be sung are psalms, and they should be done a cappella because the organ could be a distraction. So by insisting on singing only psalms, it's reinforcing his focus on the word. Okay. You get to Geneva. Songs from the Geneva Psalter regularly appear in modern psalters. Tunes do. You get the Psalter, you also get canticles, you have other kinds of songs that are also being written. Not a lot, the focus tends to be on scripture songs. This, then, for our purposes, we can jump across to England. England develops a very rich tradition of church music during the Elizabethan era. But by the time you're getting into the 18th century, the congregational singing is all, from the perspective of the people of the day, well, at least one of them, rather boring. And he started complaining to his father about this, and his father said, well, if you don't like it, write your own. His name was Isaac Watts. And so Watts begins this incredible burst of new hymnody for congregations. Then you move forward to the evangelical revival, and you get the Wesleys. Charles Wesley wrote something like 10,000 hymns. They just, because I haven't verified this, but people have a quote that they've attributed to Augustine. He who sings prays twice. And people in the revivals, with Isaac Watts, in Luther, they recognize the power of music to go beyond just simply rational acceptance of doctrine or whatever, to move the heart, which is one of the critical things that needs to be done. And so you get this flourishing, particularly coming out of the Wesleys, you get this flourishing of an amazing hymnody. But then you get to the 19th century. And in the 19th century, with the Second Great Awakening, you get another flourishing of hymnody that sounds a lot like roller skating music. If you've ever heard these songs, you will know what I mean. They tend to be far more emotive and things like that and less substantial, although there are some good hymn writers from that period as well. These tend to be mainstream within evangelical churches, even a lot of the mainline churches. This begins to change again in the 1970s with the advent of what was then called Jesus music. We now call it contemporary Christian music. And what we've got today in too many evangelical churches are people who use the current contemporary Christian hits as something that you sing in the congregation, ignoring the fact that they're next to impossible for congregations to sing and they're designed for professional performers. So there's a fast survey there. I'm sure, I've dropped a lot of things out of there, but that's the best I can do off the top of my head.
So you've mentioned a couple things that I find interesting. You mentioned the Huguenots, and you mentioned Ireland by way of Dublin. And the first time I ever went to Ulster, it seemed like a lot of the folks there made an allegation that I wonder if you could confirm, which is that in Ireland, the Irish linens are actually a product of the Huguenots being in Ireland, particularly in Protestant Northern Ireland, and their influence, the Huguenot influence in Ireland during persecution of the Huguenots, and that's why we have a thing called Irish linens. Have you ever heard anything like that?
I haven't heard it, but it wouldn't surprise me. The Huguenots were they tended to be the educated classes. I mentioned this the other day. They tended to be the educated classes, the commercial classes, people with skills. And when Louis XIV begins persecuting them, many of them will leave and they will bring their capital and their skills with them. I know there are a number of Huguenot groups that make their way to Ireland, so it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, they certainly brought their skills and their trades with them. It wouldn't surprise me if Linen was one of them, but I can't confirm that. It just sort of fits the pattern.
I'm not sure how much of a mistake this is, but could you expand on the plague?
How many hours do you have? You need to understand, I've done entire courses on plague. So, all right. So let me give you just a couple of fun facts to consider. Plague begins in Central Asia with a critter called the Siberian marmot. Marmots live they're sort of like prairie dogs. They live in underground warrens, and marmot warrens are always a reservoir to this day of plague. When I was in Mongolia traveling, we were going to go to a Somme center, a county seat basically, and we were told that the governor of the Somme center liked barbecued marmot. And I was traveling with veterinary missionaries, and I said to the vet, I'm not sure what I really think about eating marmot. And he knew I was a historian. He just looked at me and said, plague? I said, yeah. He said, yeah, it's illegal to eat marmot because of plague, but he's the governor of the Somme. Who's going to stop him? Now, it turns out we didn't get there, so I missed my opportunity to try barbecued marmot. But this is still a problem. So bubonic plague is transmitted by fleas. The fleas bite the marmot is infected, they bite the marmot, they get the bacillus in them, they jump to another one, they bite that one, the bacillus goes in. It's a little more complicated, but it's basically the idea. Due to the expansion of the Mongol Empire, which puts all the Silk Road under one political authority, and the fact that there are people traveling across it, and the fact that you've got climate change going on, somehow somebody ran into a marmot that they shouldn't have and got bitten by a flea. And this is going to begin a process by which the plague is going to spread from Central Asia through China into India, across Central Asia, through the Middle East, across North Africa, and into Europe. We usually think of plague in connection with Europe largely because Europe has the best records that have been studied. Apparently, China's got a lot of records on it, but nobody's read them in decades, or probably centuries. But we always think of plague in connection with Europe because we got records of it. They discussed it. In England, we've got exceptionally good records, and we can actually trace the mortality rate. It's 51%. So in the space of 3 years, from 1348 to 1351, half the population of Europe died. And by the way, plague comes in a basket of forms. Bubonic is the one everybody knows about. Caused by flea bites, the bacillus gets into your bloodstream. It travels to major centers of lymph nodes, armpit, groin, or neck, whichever one is closest. Multiplies there. You get a growth there called a bubo, hence the name bubonic plague. And in the absence of modern antibiotics, 65% of the population, judging from modern plague outbreaks, 65% of the population dies within about a week or so. Now, if you have a lung infection, it can become pneumonic. The infection can get in your lungs. And when that happens, two things occur. You die in 2 days, 95% of the time. But it also can become airborne and pass directly person to person without a flea. That's really bad. In the worst version, now that's only the second. In the worst version, it's called septicemic plague. This is where the bacillus begins to multiply uncontrollably in the bloodstream. And when that happens, sometimes the first symptom is death. Sometimes, not always. Okay, so now the thing to keep in mind about all of this, now I can go on and on, believe me, but the thing to keep in mind of all of this is Europe was basically overpopulated in 1300. Plague wipes out half of it around 1350. This changes European society economically, socially, and otherwise. Interesting thing, judging from the sources we have in England, the clergy died at a higher rate than the general population because the clergy were serious enough about their duties to their parishioners that they went and ministered to the dying even though they knew it would expose them to plague. But the effect of this is that the church needed to replenish the numbers of clergy, so they started lowering standards. And the net result is, over time, with the lowered standards, by the time you're a century later, the clergy has largely become the butt of jokes in Europe. I mentioned the idea of he drinks like a monk. You know, if I told you, you know, I heard a great joke. There was this monk. It's probably about drinking. If it's a priest or a nun, it's probably about sex. I mean, this is just the level at which the reputation of the clergy sank. That is one of the things that's going to lead to, I mentioned yesterday, the need for reform in the church. And along with this, it's going to contribute to the environment that allows Luther's ideas to spread so quickly because people are looking at the church and saying this, you know, for generations, they've been saying this thing is just an absolute joke. But the church had a monopoly on a product everybody wanted, that's salvation. So as long as they had that monopoly on how you get saved, no matter how bad the clergy were, you had to go to them. What Luther does is break the monopoly. He says you don't need the church, you just need Christ.